and around the country. C-SPAN is brought to you by your cable or satellite provider.
Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now, Andrew Clevenger of CQ Roll Call. He's their defense policy reporter here to talk about the recent announcement of the Missile Defense Review. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is it and what is its purpose?
Well, the Missile Defense Review is an analysis and assessment of the threats to the United States and its allies that come from foreign countries via missile.
When it comes to the review process, why does it need regular reviews and what things go into consideration for that review?
Well, it really sets Pentagon policy for how it wants to go about defending against missile strikes. This is the first new review since 2010. That was the last time the administration did a missile defense review. Back then it was called the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. This review takes away the ballistic, and so it's just the Missile Defense Review. Meaning it's embracing a wider array of threats because it's not just ballistic missiles that the Pentagon is worried about now.
When it comes to the actual threat then that leads up to the review, there's a line there that I want you to kind of bounce off it. It says this: the 2019 MDR is based on the recognition that the threat environment is markedly more dangerous than years past and demands a concerted U.S. effort to improve existing capabilities for both homeland and regional missile defense. Tell us why.
Traditionally, the main concern has been a ballistic missile coming from a rogue state, someone like North Korea or Iran, out of the blue, sort of striking without notice. And we've geared our defenses towards that type of threat. But recently, as technology is advanced, there are now more regional weapons that can hit quickly at a closer range. And there are also Russia and China, which the Pentagon has identified as our near-peer competitors in a great power competition, have developed more advanced weapons, including hypersonic weapons, which move very fast, very quickly, and unlike a ballistic missile, they can maneuver. So you can't just plot its course and figure out where it's coming down and defend that way. You have to actually track it in real time.
Missile defense is our topic for this last half hour. I take a look at the recent review of the missile defense systems of the United States. If you want to ask our guests questions, we've divided the lines through where you live. As far as the Eastern and Central time zones, it's 202-748-8000. For the Mountain and Pacific time zones, it's 202-748-8001. Perhaps you're a member of active military and you have special interest on this. It's 202-748-8002. Let's hear from the president from the recent announcement concerning the MDR and what he's hoping to see come from it.
Our review calls for 20 new ground-based interceptors at Fort Greely, Alaska, and new radars and sensors to immediately detect foreign missiles launched against our great nation. We are committed to establishing a missile defense program that can shield every city in the United States, and we will never negotiate away our right to do this.
Certainly not exhaustive, Andrew Clevenger, but as far as the specifics he laid out there, what's the rationale?
Well, the 20 ground-based interceptors he's mentioning have already been authorized and a down payment has been paid by Congress. Those are going to go in Fort Greely, Alaska, where the U.S. already has 40 ground-based interceptors. And those are, again, tasked towards the ICBMs that might come from North Korea. It's an ambitious commitment to defend against any missile strike anywhere. I don't think the Pentagon is quite prepared to do that. There are other ways to defend against missile strikes than hitting every missile.
If you go to the website for the Missile Defense Agency, it gives you 3 examples of how we defend against missiles. I'll read them to you, just the bullet points, and you can expand on them as you wish. There's a boost section, a mid-course, and a terminal. Walk us through that as far as the capabilities we have.
So boost section is when an enemy missile is just been fired and is just coming up, probably out of the ground, and is gaining altitude and speed. The advantage of hitting it there is it's on their turf. You're less worried about it actually hitting its target, and it's not going quite as fast. Then a ballistic missile will take a long mid-course flight as it travels across the globe. It probably will leave the atmosphere and then have to navigate reentry. That gives a fairly lengthy window to try and hit it. Of course, it's going quite quickly at this point, and it's far away. So that poses its challenges. The terminal descent is really, high stakes, because if you miss, it's right on top of your target, and you might not get another shot.
So that's what you don't want.
That's what you don't want.
When it comes then to the capabilities do we have, is it more on the boost side, the midsection, or the terminal at this point?
Well, the ground-based interceptors are designed to be mid-course, to take that long period where it's arcing over the globe. The Pentagon would very much like to get at boost phase. And there's the Missile Defense Review authorizes a study to look at arming an F-35, so our latest fighter jet, with a missile that's capable of downing a enemy missile in boost phase. That's technically very tricky to do, but the Pentagon thinks it can be done.
How advanced in the technology side are we as far as stopping missiles, and how has that progressed over the last couple of decades?
We are pretty advanced. I think the Pentagon would always like to have greater capabilities, and the Pentagon absolutely recognizes that our peers are not standing still. They are advancing their own capabilities, and a hypersonic missile poses a serious challenge. To get at that, the Missile Defense Review wants to put a sensor array in space so that you can have what they call birth-to-death tracking. Because with a hypersonic, as I mentioned, it's not like a ballistic missile where you can calculate its course and figure out where it's coming down very early. You have to really track it as it's moving, and of course it's moving very, very quickly, about Mach 5.
And before we take some calls, when it comes to a price tag for all these, for what we have and what we want, where are we at?
It's going to be very expensive. The 20 ground-based interceptors I mentioned before that Congress has already put a down payment on ate up the bulk of about $5 billion emergency funding for the Pentagon a little more than a year ago. We haven't seen a price tag for a lot of the things that the Missile Defense Review proposes. We're hoping to see them in the Pentagon's budget submission, which we hope to see in February, but that might be delayed because of the shutdown.
Again, this is for the Eastern and Central time zones. It's 202-748-8000. If you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-748-8001. And if you are active or retired military and you want to give your thoughts on missile defense, 202-748-8002. Our guest, Andrew Clevenger, defense policy reporter for CQ Roll Call. We'll start off with Michael in Philadelphia. Michael, you're on. Go ahead.
Mr. Clevenger, about these supersonic, I just came in on the show, and you were talking about how they deviate course and all. I was wondering if there was some type of electromagnetic missile that could disorient any possible electronics on such a missile.
That's not a concept that I'm familiar with or that I've heard talked about a lot in the Pentagon. But I think one thing to remember with a lot of the hypersonic weapons is some of them fire initially and then are actually gliding. And so it needs very little maneuvering of fins to change its course. I'm not sure that an electromagnetic weapon would be able to disrupt that, but that's probably something that the Pentagon is looking into.
A viewer off of Twitter ask you about INFs as they're described. Please explain where they are and if we're walking away from the treaty.
It looks like we are walking away from the treaty.
First of all, what's an INF?
So that would be a nuclear treaty designed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that, in that case, the U.S. and Russia have aimed at each other. Now, both of those countries have so many nuclear weapons that the opponent couldn't hope to shoot them all down. So mutually assured destruction is really the key deterrent when it comes to that. The treaties, it looks like we are walking away from them, which have limited the development of new nuclear weapons and their placement. The U.S. feels that Russia is not in compliance, and it doesn't see the point in remaining in a treaty when your partner is not playing by the same rules.
You mentioned at the outset China and Russia, always the obvious when we take a look at these issues. What about threats from other places such as the Middle East? And where are we as far as capabilities for that?
In the Middle East, there's a sophisticated sort of regional network of smaller defenses that are based around the area that could get at some of the shorter range threats that might come out of Iran. And Iran has quite a striking distance. It can reach parts of Europe with the capabilities that we believe they have. If it bulks that up at all, the concern is that perhaps it could even eventually reach the continental U.S.
From South Bend, Indiana, James is next. James, good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, it has a really good website. I wonder if Andrew's familiar with publicintegrity.org. Maybe he can give us some facts and figures on military spending. I think it was Eisenhower said the military-industrial complex will bankrupt America, and here we are, $23 trillion in debt. But my dad was a World War II vet, and he always said war should never be Wall Street traded and for profit. And I wondered how Andrew feels about the biblical passage, James 4:2. The cause of war is greed and covetousness.
Well, I think the Eisenhower quote is something that gets tossed around a lot and has been seen as very prescient because the development of a massive industry in terms of defending this country. The missile defense portion of the defense budget, I don't think is the part that's going to necessarily break the bank. The causes of war are very tough to get at and certainly above my pay grade. So I guess I'm going to leave that to the planners and the deciders on that one.
From California, George is next. Hi there.
Hi, good morning.
You're on. Go ahead. Oh, hung up. Let's go to Richard. Richard's in Ohio. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. I kind of follow this industry to a certain extent. And anyway, I read about what China's developing of different kinds of missiles and stuff like that. But, we got maybe 44 defense missiles to stop ICBMs. But what if they launch 2,000? And frankly, how many cities in the United States have to be nuked to destroy this country? And I think what we're doing is crazy. We're trying to pick a fight with China over trade, for crying out loud, and this is going to get freaking out of hand because we're going around trying to intimidate them militarily, and they're going to do the same damn thing to us. And frankly, economically speaking, they can produce missiles a lot cheaper than we can. Anyway, what do you think about all that?
Well, you raise a great point. Having 44 ground-based interceptors is not a blanket deterrent against any missile that could be launched our way from that side of the Pacific. I think they're designed more towards a rogue strike, perhaps from North Korea, where you don't anticipate a massive sort of wave of missiles that you're describing. So far, the best deterrent against that kind of strike has been the fact that we can hit them back. And if you launch 2,000 missiles at us, certainly they can evade our defenses, but you're going to be staring at 2,000 missiles coming back at you, and that's the end of the ball game.
Andrew Clevenger, because missile defense depends on alliances with countries, and we have a president who sometimes is very critical of allies, how does that rhetoric factor into these longer-term negotiations with nuclear deals and accords and treaties? Does it have an impact?
It does. I think some of our allies are very nervous because the rhetoric he uses and questioning, NATO's defense spending, things suggesting that our allies are sort of getting a free ride. The allies rely on U.S. commitments to keep them safe. If the U.S. were to draw back significantly from South Korea, I think, Japan would be very nervous. They're very close to North Korea, and North Korea certainly has the capability of hitting them very quickly and easily. So it is important to reaffirm these commitments to keep our allies confident.
This is from Gerard. Gerard from Georgia. Hi.
Hey, how you doing? I was wondering, there was some news about a month or two ago, about Russia had a way of scrambling the GPS system. We had some exercises, and they had a way to scramble them, so the GPS wouldn't be used. And the other thing, atomic war, everybody would die. Nobody's going to start an atomic war. That's just a bunch of baloney. I'll wait and listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And yes, a nuclear exchange would be devastating. Frankly, a single nuclear weapon anywhere across the globe would be a devastating loss of life. And that is the incentive, of course, not to let that happen. Russian capabilities, they are very good at electronic warfare, as you mentioned. If they are able to disrupt GPS, that would be challenging to the Pentagon. But of course, the Pentagon has more than one type of sensor to rely on, so that's not the whole ball game if GPS is knocked out.
Andrew Clevenger, if you go to the Missile Defense Agency, there's pictures of all the various items that are used in this tracker, this idea of missile defense. How does the defense contractor come into all of that?
Well, missile defense, as we've been discussing, is a hugely challenging enterprise, and there's a lot to coordinate. So if you're talking about striking an incoming ICBM, I mean, first you have to be aware of its launch. Second, you have to have sensors that are able to tell you where it's going, and then you have to have the capability to get your interceptor in front of it so that they can collide. It's been described as shooting a bullet with a bullet. So for a defense contractor, it really requires a marshaling of resources, and often they have to work together because one company will do a sensor that works and feeds information to the missile that another company will develop to shoot down the incoming missile.
Who are the top defense contractors, and how much are they getting paid to develop and keep this kind of technology going, in a general sense?
Boeing is the main contractor on ground-based interceptors. Raytheon has an extensive missile defense business. Lockheed Martin has THAAD missile defense system. That's part of the regional defenses that the U.S. and its allies deploy. It's a billion-dollar industry, no question.
We'll hear from Mark. Mark is from New York. Hi there.
Hi, how are you this morning? Thanks for taking my call on C-SPAN. Yes, I'm wondering why we spend $770 billion on defense. The Russians only spend $60 billion. The Chinese only spend approximately the same. You mean to tell me we can't control the world like we are now? And if Mr. Kim was to let off one nuke, he's got 200 coming back at him. I don't believe they're going to do that. It's a false claim, and it's a waste of money.
Well, you raise a good point, and the U.S. does top defense spending globally, but the Pentagon is very clear. Our adversaries, our potential adversaries, are catching up, and they have not been sleeping while the U.S. has been busy in conflicts in the Middle East. In fact, they've been going to school on American capabilities and working very hard. They have good scientists and engineers. They've been working very hard to develop capabilities that can, not just counter ours, but surpass ours. So I think the Pentagon thinks that, they're playing a little bit of catch-up in some of these missile defense regions, and that's going to be very expensive.
Let's hear from Angelo, Massachusetts. Good morning.
Hi. How far have we come with knocking down missiles with lasers?
That is a great issue. It's something that's contemplated in the Missile Defense Review. They're calling for a study of 6 months to produce a report on the feasibility of that. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but lasers in space is not that far-fetched, and having a laser that can disrupt an ICBM while it's in the mid-course section, being already based in space, makes a lot of sense, and I think that's not so far-fetched.
Andrew Clevenger, while we got you here, a couple of topics to talk about. Space Force. We heard a lot about this from last year when the president launched it. Where are we as far as the development of this force?
The Pentagon is doing the organizational steps. It's taking the organizational steps that it is capable of doing without Congress. Acting Secretary Patrick Shanahan recently, via memo, designated Undersecretary of Defense Michael Griffin to oversee the Space Development Agency. That's sort of the hub of acquiring assets for space, overseeing the parts you need to assemble a space force. Now, what remains to be seen is what the Pentagon's budget request looks like in terms of specific money for Space Force, and whether Congress buys in. I mean, a lot of the changes necessary are going to have to be authorized by Congress.
And just to remind our viewers, the purpose of Space Force, what is it?
Well, as we've been discussing, the U.S. has a lot of assets that are in space already. A lot of GPS satellites are up in space, and if we're going to be putting more assets in space, as the Missile Defense Review contemplates, we're going to need to defend those more rigorously. Amongst the capabilities that China and Russia are developing are the ability to get at our assets in space, and they are sometimes described as juicy targets by the Pentagon, and they need to be defended.
This is from Washington State. Maria, hello.
Hello. How are you guys doing?
Fine, you're on with our guest. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is, the waterways of the Philippines, when MacArthur came back from World War II to help us in the Philippines, the waterways are very important to the Navy. Is the Navy system update themselves at the situation on the island of the Philippines?
Oh, sorry about that, caller. I apologize, but Mr. Clevenger.
I'm sorry. I'm not quite clear on where you were going with that, so I'm not sure I have a ton to add in terms of the waterways of the Philippines.
But if you go to the MDA website, there's something called an Aegis Spy 1 radar. It's based on a ship. What's that capability? How many of those we have, and where's the naval aspect of it?
The Navy doesn't just have radar, but it has defensive missiles that are on board ships, and it's a key element of our regional defenses to have Aegis systems on board those missile destroyers. So the Navy has a key role to play in regional missile defense.
And when you say Aegis systems, what do you mean by that?
Aegis is a I'm going to mess up the acronym here, but it's active. I won't even try, but it's a radar sensor system.
From Lorenzo. Lorenzo joins us from Louisiana. He's also calling on our line for those who are either active or retired military. Lorenzo, hello. Go ahead.
Yes, so I was calling on a couple of things. One is that the United States, they're talking about the wall. We've only been attacked twice, and that's once by the airplanes from the Saudis, and then the other time was by the Russians with this in the election. And the wall is not going to be able to stop that. The other thing is that when I was over there, we was over there in Saudi, in Iraq, and that I want to give a shout out to those guys at the Patriot system. They knocked down everything Saddam tried to throw up there. And the other thing is that don't fear Russia and don't fear China. They have no way that they can deal with America. And I don't appreciate getting on the public and putting all this information out to the public. This top secret stuff, I mean, even though it's been unclassified, I don't think we should be putting fear in Americans talking about what China can do and what Russia can do.
Okay, Lorenzo, thank you.
You raised a good point, one that the Patriot system was very successful during the Gulf War invasion. That remains a key system for regional missile defense, and that success was something that our competitors took close note of and started working very hard to counteract that, get past that. I take your point about not wanting to talk too carefully about our capabilities, but at the same time, you lose some of the deterrent effect of our capabilities if you don't let your adversary know that you can stop some of what they're contemplating. It's good for China and Russia to know that a volley of nuclear weapons is going to meet with a volley of nuclear weapons coming back at them. That is a very effective deterrent against and a key role in missile defense. And for North Korea, might think it might be able to slip one missile through or test in that regard. It's good to telegraph that we are able to counteract that.
Andrew Clevenger, who covers defense policy for CQ Roll Call, is joining us to talk about missile defense. CQRollCall.com is the website if you want to see more of his work. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we take you now to the House of Representatives.